Hi, this is Paul, and I want to share with you a thesis that I've been working on. I actually made a much longer video of this that was too ranty, and as I mentioned at the end of this video, I put it in the new membership section of my channel. Progressives are losing because moderates have stopped evolving in the way that progressives have anticipated moderates to evolve. The CRC establishment has been moderate progressive since the counterculture years. And over the last decade, the moderates have slowly been peeling off and looking to conservatives for more leadership. Extended bodies like the CRC and its subbodies or subminds have vague eschatological expectation. There's sort of an arc of history that is out there that people think, well, this is the way things are going to go. Now, these anticipations are absolutely normal and basically what human beings do. We can't help but have them and work from them and try to use them to navigate into the future, but they're always only so accurate and so helpful because none of us really do know the future. The assumption always was that Grand Rapids East was the vanguard and the rest of the moderates in the Christian Reformed diaspora would follow, and that isn't happening. Now, this has a lot to do with the breakdown of the circulatory system of the Christian Reformed Church that I've spoken about in previous videos. How, if you look right after the Second World War, and even before that, Christian Reformed people would sort of gather in Western Michigan and go out to the diaspora, and then many would come back to Calvin College, find mates. I mean, we're sort of like sea turtles in that way. And that whole system has been breaking down since the 80s and 90s. In some ways, probably my generation was the last generation to really participate that in a big time. And with each successive generation, it's getting smaller and smaller. And you can track that with the enrollment of Calvin University and the proportion of that university that comes from Christian Reformed students. Now, part of what's difficult to track about that is that there have been major population declines too, and the baby boomers are a big part of this. Now, I want to define some terms here because these terms are commonly used, but I think we can get a good enough approximation of them within the Christian Reformed environment. Now these are spectrums and not boxes, which means that there are some moderates that tend to lean progressive, and there's some moderates that tend to lean conservative. So progressive and conservative are the two poles, and we're just going to use those terms because they tend to be out there, the terms that people use. Your mileage may vary with respect to any given individual. I would estimate that progressives are about 20% of the Christian Reformed denomination, and the majority of them tend to be in West Michigan and Canada. Geography is probably not the best indicator. University education or university participation, college, academics in the Christian Reformed Church. One of the things that I want to touch on at some point in the future is the interesting relationship between the Christian Reformed Church and its love for its academics. That's a huge deal in the Christian Reformed Church in terms of really elite status. Now, progressives, we can sort of track these with respect to two issues. Let's use women in church office. That's WICO is my acronym for Women in Church Office. That's the one we've used on Voices for years. Women in Church Office and same-sex marriage. Progressive is pretty easy, in favor of women in church office and in favor of same-sex marriage. Conservatives are about, I think, 25% and growing, but their growth, I don't think, is really from the moderates. I think their growth is mostly from outside the Christian Reformed Church. As I mentioned before, the Christian Reformed Church, because of the end of the baby boom, because of basically white evangelical middle class and affluent academic education, are having fewer and fewer children themselves, and more of them. Remember, churches leak left and split right generally, and that's what makes this current mode in the Christian Reformed Church quite unusual. Christian Reformed families that are sort of leaning progressive towards that pole tend to have fewer children, and they're less likely to go to Calvin. They're less likely to do a bunch of different things. So moderates are growing. The Koreans or conservatives are growing from outside the Christian Reformed Church. Koreans are reliably conservative, especially first and 1.5 generations. Hispanics are reliably conservative. African Americans are fairly reliably conservative. African dynamics are a little bit different. And you can see this at Synod. Now, so yeah, conservatives are fairly easy. Women in church office, that issue is more complex. I'm going to talk about the relationships between these issues a little bit later in the video. Often, a true conservative is a complementarian. They're against women in church office, and they're against same-sex marriage. But a lot of the deeper conservatives that couldn't tolerate being in a denomination where women were serving in ecclesiastical office, many of them left with the URC split in the 1990s. Classis Minn Coda has sort of become an affinity classis, and that's sort of where Classis Minn Coda is a little bit different from, let's say, Classis Zealand. So there's a lot of internal dynamics that go into there. But my estimation of the no on women in church office and the no on same-sex marriage is about 25% of the denomination. Now, someone looking at these numbers might think, well, if the progressives leave, but the splits are never that clean, because churches are never completely 100% or another. When a church sort of gets 100%, like the situation we had at First Ripon, well, then they'll tend to peel off. But most Christian Reformed churches are a blend of all of these, and you could hear those testimonies at Synod with respect to them. Now, that puts moderates in the middle, and I think they're more evenly distributed around the denomination. And generally speaking, in the denomination, moderates are either enthusiastic or tolerant about women in church office. They will support it in their local church, but they are skittish and hesitant about same-sex marriage. And now your mileage may vary with respect to any individual person. Someone like David Struck, the father of Ryan Struck, I haven't spoken with David for years and years, but knowing David from where he comes from, where he's serving, his story with his son, David Struck is in some ways one of these fairly moderate CRC pastors who, because of his relationship with his son, has gone, let's say, progressive on that issue. But generally speaking, David Struck probably is a sort of conservative-ish, evangelical-ish Christian Reformed minister. And David, if you're listening to this, or Ryan, if you think I'm doing anything wrong, if David and Ryan want to come on my channel, have a father-son talk on my channel, you're more than welcome. All of it, of course, subject to my time constraints, but David, because I went to the same high school as you, didn't really know you. I believe you're in my sister's class, my older sister's class. That would be fine. There's also an issue here in terms of how far into the baby boom, because there's a generational thing going here, and the baby boomers white baby boomers are disproportionately dominant in the progressive era. That there's something to do with the counterculture in that cultural DNA that's going on here. The expectation was, because the baby boomers thought they were the cutting edge of history, it was the age of Aquarius, that people after them would get more and more progressive. And part of the reason that was the idea was because that was the conservative fear and the progressive hope, and they sort of were in agreement with that. In other words, these long-standing eschatological, usually vague assumptions were in alignment, and conservatives basically energized via their anxiety, and progressives energized via their enthusiasm and their positive expectations. And so, again, the entire culture sort of assumed this is the way it was going to go, and conservatives would reliably tend to use fear of that as an organizing and sort of a Girardian strengthening dynamic for their own little groups. Because in many ways, fear is one of the most powerful motivators that we have. And we see this in politics all the time. People start being nice, but the closer it gets to the election, everybody keeps hitting the fear button. Because it doesn't matter what you think of me, how good you think I am. What really matters, especially for the moderates, is make them afraid. And so we're going to have to talk about that dynamic too. Now, when I'm talking about moderates, these are a lot of the guys on my channel. Now, Pete has been on my channel, and again, Pete, how old are you? I think Pete's a little bit older than I am. Again, I'm sort of at the cusp, because I was born in '63. So I was just at the end of the baby boom, just at the beginning of the Xers. And given where I grew up in a fairly progressive area in a fairly progressive Christian Reformed church, I probably tended to bleed a little bit Xer, but I've still got some of that boomer stuff in me. And it's very interesting that a lot of the IDW types that sort of have a big part of this little corner, Jordan Peterson, John Vervaeke, Brett Weinstein, we're all sort of in that end of the baby boom, beginning of the next demographic thing. But when I look at bread and butter moderates, I usually look to guys sort of a seminary generation beneath me. I went to Calvin Seminary in the 80s. Some of these guys went in the late 90s or aughts. Guys like I've had on my channel, Nate Vendenin and David Salverda. And, I know a lot of these guys because increasingly boomers are retiring from the CRC. Also, often when it comes to local parish ministry, once local ministers get in their 50s, they either want to get out or they've really loved it and they want to stay in it. That's sort of a dividing line. And what getting out usually means is they go into chaplaincy or some non-governmental organization, or they become a denominational bureaucrat or something like this. And it's usually about in their 50s that ministers have either had enough of the local church and they want to do something else, or they've always loved the local church and they want to stay there and they're going to do it even after they retire. So these younger guys that are in their 30s and 40s now, these are the guys I'm watching. And I've been noticing, again, the trend that they're not sort of following the boomer expectations of what moderates would be doing. Now, again, all of this is generalizations, and there are individuals who have, and I can name those names, but when I look at them, many of the guys that I see, again, in their 30s and 40s, sort of towards the end of their 20s, partly because we did a lot of church planter recruiting, myself and Kevin Adams back in the day, and we have a lot of these guys in the church planting networks. And so I know a lot of these guys in their 30s and 40s, and they're not evolving. In fact, a lot of them are getting less conservative than they were 3, 5, 7 years ago. And that's a very interesting thing. Now, again, this getting more progressive and more conservative, this is way low resolution. And I'm speaking with respect mostly to these kinds of issues like women in church office and same-sex marriage. With respect to other things, again, you'll regularly find these guys with icons in their offices. You'll regularly find these guys who are, maybe their local church won't go there, but they kind of want weekly communion. You'll regularly find these guys more and more sort of in the gravitational pull of what I call the neo-sacramentalism. Now, the CRC post-World War II script would imagine, sort of the baby boom script, would have imagined that most of us would be trending into the affirming camp. And that was part of the strategy that All One Body had, that, well, don't fight them like with synodical study reports. It's that given enough time, just like women in office, more and more people will come around to their senses and they'll hear the stories, and that'll just be it. And it isn't happening. The assumption is, well, more LGBTQ experience, local experience, personal stories, more ongoing education, continue to read those books that are coming out from the establishment and from the church far beyond, more institutional pragmatism. There was one speech given by a business guy in the Synod that said, come on, it's obvious what we have to do. It's just obvious from a business perspective. And they just sort of follow the middlebrow culture with a respectable 10-year lag. And you just sort of follow Christianity Today, Carol Stream. You just sort of follow the evangelicals as they sort of continue to evolve, and then we'll all get there. And it isn't happening. But what's interesting is that other things are happening, and I'm going to get into that and hopefully into subsequent videos, because moderates don't act towards people who talk about their same-sex attraction necessarily in the way the progressives do. They also don't do exactly like the conservatives do. And that's why they're sort of an important group to watch. And conservatives look at them and don't quite know if they trust them. Progressives look at them and say, you're going to be me in another 5 or 10 years. And none of those dynamics are really true. It's actually far more complex than this. As it's just that we as human beings, I say this often, consciousness is sort of monofocal. And then so that if something is monofocal, we tend to see dualities fairly easily. Once it gets beyond 3 or 4 things to track, we sort of break down with respect to them. Now, one of the things that's been interesting listening to the aftermath, and again, there's a lot of this on Voices. I should probably go out to Facebook, but I just hate Facebook. I mean, you can read Returning Church, you can read pastors, if you're a pastor in the CRC. You can read the pastors, CRC. One of the things about Facebook is there are a lot of closed groups where people feel comfortable enough to tell the truth. And you may or may not be allowed into some of those closed groups. And it's very interesting, the dynamics. I had a lively conversation with some friends on Voices about what on earth Grand Rapids East is doing as an establishment and why Abide is winning. But Abide is getting a whole lot of heat from the progressives. I've probed into this in a number of places, and what I hear reliably from progressives is it's all Abide's fault. Really. And they're just angry with Abide, and those little Abide report videos they really hate, and they're not always real happy with me either. But I'm a moderate, and so the progressives are less angry at the moderates because they're a little more winsome towards us because they want to draw us in. The conservatives for the progressives are a lost cause, and so many of them will just curse them and shut them out. It's kind of the same is true from the conservative camp. Conservatives will be a little more winsome towards the moderates, and the progressives, they're a lost cause, shut them out. So the moderates are the swing vote. What that means is that Abide is getting a lot of complaining towards them. I don't get the sense that Abide really cares. They might sort of be in the Ben Shapiro camp or having a mug say, I drink progressive tears. In other words, just fill my cup, progressives. You want to hate on me? Hate on me the more, because the more you hate on me, the more moderates watch that and think, do I really want to be a progressive? Do I really want to be a hater like the progressives? No. We're the party of love, not the party of hate. It's way more complex than that. I also don't think Abide is really influencing moderates very much. I think moderates kind of look at both sides and have a sense of both sides, and moderates can tend to usually live either way. That's why they're a swing vote. And they think, yeah, it's good to have some conservatives around. And they look around and say, yeah, it's good to have some progressives around. And I think that's part of the reason that the Paul DeVries vote, let's keep kneeling for another year. We're clear that they did wrong. Because what moderates really do want is a degree of order. And what's interesting is that what's going on in the culture war with the polarization is that increasingly both conservatives and progressives also want order. And so the fight is over, of course, the rules of that order. But I don't see Abide really influencing a lot of moderates. I think Abide, again, is growing through bringing in people from outside the denomination, both other white conservatives, African Americans, Asians, Hispanics. And again, the irony is that it's been the progressives that have been flying the flag about diversity in the denomination. There was just another big thing in the banner online about that. Here it is, big article by Chris Meehan. Now, Chris Meehan wrote a wonderful biography of my former pastor, Dante Venegas. It's a great biography. I really enjoyed it. But, Dante Venegas affirming? Never. That wasn't Dante. Even Dave Beelan, who's supposed to be, kind of the white partnership of that dynamic duo from the 1980s at Madison Square and Grand Rapids. See, now I'm dropping names that Grand Rapids Christian Reformed people would know. The evolving face of the CRC. Now, Willowdale, Toronto, has a very interesting history, and in many ways, Willowdale has. Well, I don't want to go too much into storytelling, But so you've got Willowdale, Toronto, you've got Westminster, BC, two Canadian congregations, Resurrection Church, East Boston, okay, and African Community Fellowship in Kentwood. Then Four Corners, Arizona. Now, some of those, because this progressive conservative line doesn't sort of chop down racial lines, but again, generally speaking, percentage-wise, the more the Christian Reformed Church grows in ethnic diversity, chances are the more conservative it will continue to become with respect to these issues. Now, with other issues, it might be different, but with respect to many of these issues, that's been the pattern. Now, there are a matrix of pauses that are influencing the moderates. And as I said, I originally made a video about this. I've referred to this video a number of times. There's some real reasons I haven't wanted to share it publicly. I don't know if it's careful enough, and so maybe it is. There have been many times that I haven't wanted to share a video, and I share it anyway, and people say they find it helpful. So I'm really on the fence with respect to this. But I sort of feel it like a matrix of pauses, because moderates sort of feel the flow of the culture and the flow of the river, but as they're floating down, they've been noticing things. And again, I'll go back to the previous slide. The progressive assumption was that more, and you heard all of this at Synod. Well, the implicit message, I have this ministry and there's a lot of gay people, and so I know and you don't. They don't say it that way because that would be offensive, but if you only had more experience, well, everybody's getting a lot more experience since sort of the lid is off. I think I used that description in that video. And I think in many ways, moderates are happy the lid is off. I think generally speaking, moderates are okay with same-sex marriage out in the public sphere. But as they're watching this play out, they've got pauses. And so they're having more experience with gender minorities, sexual minorities, and they're thinking, I'm not so sure the boomer scripts are giving us what we want. And they are more educated. You have the internet. I mean, I regularly get some really good book recommendations from these bread and butter moderate CRC people. And, they're reading Catholics. They're reading Orthodox. They're reading atheists. They're reading broadly. And the more they read, the more pause they have. Institutional pragmatism. Well, I'm going to talk about that specifically in an upcoming video. I really wanted to make that point clearly, which is why I decided to have it in its own video rather than that big, long video that I made. And there's some real questions about the assumptions about what following the culture means. Would Roe versus Wade ever be overturned? Yes. Will Obergefell be overturned? Maybe. Will same-sex marriage go back to the state level? It's important to remember that in 2008, in a state referendum, a referendum banning same-sex marriage passed. Now, I don't think that would be true today, but I've often noted that it's very much the moderates that are in blue states that are looking around and they're not evolving like the boomers in West Michigan and some places in Canada think they ought. And this is extremely confusing and maddening, and so they look to blame someone, and so they blame Abide. So, sorry, Abide. I know you're getting the blame, but... And this is going on in the broader culture, too. Remember the end of history where after the Cold War, it was just between here and Star Trek and off we go. And it didn't happen. Remember during the Obama administration, all of this speculation in the media that, it's really doubtful that the Republican Party, as constituted, will ever win the White House again. Who did we have? Trump. Now, most moderates I know, no fans of Trump. No fans of Trump. But the end of history, the end of the Republican Party, didn't happen. Now, part of the dynamic in the Christian Reformed Church over really the boomer years has been the conservatives have sort of been kind of like the Republicans in the state of California. These are the opposition that you keep around in order to continue to be able to play sort of this parasitic narrative thing where we're the revolutionary party and we're the ones who are fighting the man and we're the ones who are fighting the old way of life. We're the ones fighting the old regime. We're the vanguard of the new liberation era. The difficulty that the liberationists are having is that at some point you can sort of liberate yourself out of ontology. And the moderates are watching, and they're watching this, and they're saying, I'm not sure these liberation moments are upgrades. There are other things are happening, and so, I'm not necessarily looking to kick the progressives out. I'm less and less buying their program, and that's been giving credibility to the conservatives, but partly because moderates are reading people that they're not necessarily sort of the modernist conservatives that are around. They're reading church fathers and they're reading Roman Catholics. And so this is where you get into the question of the end of modernity. And of course, this is happening in the far broader culture too. I know today, if you mention Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, and Dave Rubin, well, these are, Brett Weinstein, but these are just these people have evolved to become culture war conservatives. But 10 years ago, look at Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, and Dave Rubin 10 years ago. And while Jordan Peterson, Brett Weinstein, and Dave Rubin might be seen as sort of outliers, there's a lot of people who have been listening to them and saying, they've got some points. And they certainly weren't wrong about everything. And I may be overly generous adding Dave Rubin to that list. So in the CRC, the moderates are swing votes, and the easiest place to see that was the door hinge that Paul de Vries's speech was. I mean, you could, in some ways, part of the reason that Scott Vanderploeg's speech was just an amazing thing is Scott isn't an establishment figure like Paul de Vries in the denomination. Scott Vanderploeg, like me, is out on the fringes. He's out there, in South Florida. I'm way out here in California. These are not Christian Reformed areas. And so we're fringe players. Paul de Vries is about as establishment as you can get. And he swung that hinge. And the moderates followed, and the vote swung the other way. Now, again, there's all gradations of moderates, and I think many moderates sort of heard Paul de Vries say, for Pete's sake, the timeline in this only gives them 6 months. Out of any human decency, give them more time. And then sort of whispering, even though it's not going to make a difference in the outcome. And enough moderates heard that and said, okay, another year. Sort of like the parable. But there are the moderates. They are the swing votes. And again, what's been happening in the denomination is the moderates have been happy for Abide to provide some of the leadership and take the fire from the progressives. Go ahead, hate on Abide. They drink liberal tears. And Abide can hate on progressives. They want to own the libs, yada, yada, yada. But the moderates like to just kind of sit back and watch. And they'll make their move when they decide to make their move. The moderates are the one deciding the pacing and just how far things will go. But now remember that your classis may vary. And the CRC, the way it works, if you're in a very conservative classis, it's different than if you're in a rather progressive classis. And classis Central California is a very moderate classis. We've got some very conservative churches, and we've got some moderate churches, but the progressive churches are really pretty much defunct. The progressive churches, as in the videos that I've talked about, they're not a political force in the classis and in the denomination. The progressives have to look to some spaces in Canada and West Michigan for a lot of their strength. Now, this was the first title of the video that is in the membership section. What CRC Progressives have to do to stop losing and why they won't. And you can see, you get a sense of how I was feeling that day. And I thought, do I really want to make that video? And I'd been stewing on it for 2 or 3 days. And so then I made the video. And afterwards I thought, do I really want to release that video? In some ways, I'm really teasing this video, but in another way, I don't know how many people I want to watch, so I just threw it into this membership section and said, let's see what happens. It's kind of how the channel started. Throw it out there. Let's see what happens. This is an existential loss for the CRC Progressives. For those of you outside the denomination, I cannot make that point more sufficiently strong. I was chatting with someone, sort of conservative, moderate that I've known for years in West Michigan, and he just said, Grand Rapids is weird right now. Yeah, it's because all of these things that the establishment could assume, especially the progressive end of the establishment, they now know their time is ending, and they're hurting, and they're angry, and they're mourning, and they're grieving. It's a mess. Anger, bargaining, denial, all those stages of grief, except for some of them, resignation. Well, some of them are out there, and they're trying to figure out what to do. They've got another year to decide now. I think next year, I don't know what next year will bring. It'll be interesting. Progressives have held the establishment for 50 years. And I think the real question, again, this is the point of this video, it's worth thinking about why they've lost the moderates now. And again, I'm listening to both sides. It's because of Trump. No, it's not because of Trump. Trump was an expression of other things in the culture, and Trump is Trump. It's not because of Trump. A lot of it has to do, I think, with the end of the last Great Awakening, which was the Civil Rights Movement. This is a thumbnail for a video that I did a while ago. I don't know if it was my best video, but how the Civil Rights Great Awakening created the religion that denies it's a religion. This gets into a bunch of my thinking with respect to what is secularity and what does the end of modernity mean. So the Civil Rights Movement in many ways was the last Great Awakening, but because it didn't look like the Great Awakening looks when we sort of look back on it through American or church history books, and because the culture has changed, it was a Great Awakening. And it unleashed so much moral power, it changed Western religion. It's a deeply Christian movement. You cannot read Dr. King. You cannot see how Gandhi, basically steals pages from Jesus with respect to a number of things to afford the breakout of India from the British Raj. It's a deeply Christian movement, and it also works hand in hand with secularity, because I think as, again, we continue to see modernity recede, secularity is going to continue to be exposed as sort of Christianity light. Now, I know for some of you CRC people who are listening to this, that might sound almost unintelligible. For those of you who've been listening to the channel for a while, this is a thesis I've been working on for quite a while, sort of following the work of Tom Holland, the history writer out of the UK. It allows people of other religions to be a sort of a Christian and a Muslim or a Jew or an atheist or a Jedi or a Hogwarts. It allows all of these things, but the canon of that religion is also continuing to migrate, and the dividing up of that canon is really where things are at. If you follow more conservative conversations, in Catholic or to a degree Orthodox, but the Orthodox aren't really a force on the American scene. But if you follow where a lot of Catholic conversations have been going, you have the end of modernity, you have the end of secularity, and what that means, and how will you really deal with pluralism when secularity was sort of the way? Maybe for you CRC people, I should play one of my favorite Tim Keller clips now towards the end of his life. Maybe you'll find that intelligible. Now, I know for a lot of the regular channel people, I haven't done my promised Tim Keller video yet, but Tim Keller, a decade ago, was a really important figure in the Christian Reformed Church. I think the polarization hadn't gotten to the point that it was. Some progressives were still a little skittish about him because of his stance on women as elders and pastors, and because, Tim Keller was a very attractive figure about 10 years ago in the Christian Reformed Church, and the Christian Reformed Church sort of looked at Tim Keller with a lot of Tim Keller envy, and that was sort of across the spectrum, some conservatives, moderates, and progressives. And sort of what happened was the conservatives sort of got, they sort of got disaffected because of the winsomeness, and the progressives got disaffected because of the Tim Keller didn't evolve out of the PCA like he should have, like, let's say, City Church San Francisco, that has sort of followed the evolutionary track perfectly. City Church San Francisco sort of started as a quasi-church plant of Tim Keller, Fred Harrell, and Scott Sherman. Scott Sherman had been a church planter under Tim Keller for the PCA. They planted this church in San Francisco. It grew quite large in San Francisco as a conservative PCA church. They switched over to the RCA, and switching promising. At that point, we had very close relations with RCA Class of Central California because of some projects that were funded by the DeVosses. So they came into the RCA just huffing and puffing, promising that women in office is as far as they'll go. And then women in office wasn't as far as they went. And they sort of segmented themselves off into city classes and affinity classes, and then they evolved on same-sex marriage stuff, and in some ways the church collapsed because it lost all their energy. And that story alone is a really important part of this moderates not evolving. Because moderates, let's say around here that had been watching all of this, we had been excited about City Church San Francisco. Some of our church planters were being mentored by City Church San Francisco. We were excited when they sort of joined the RCA because we thought, oh, look, they're even closer to us now. We can learn from them, and maybe we can experience the same kind of growth they are. And then when they evolved into a more of an affirming stance, and then when we watched what that happened, a lot of progressives took a step back and said, it's always good to learn from somebody else's experience. We're not quite so sure that evolution is exactly doing what everyone thinks it's doing. So here's one of my favorite recent Tim Keller clips.
This is hard. So let me give you the best answer I can. Liberal democracy, which is how I'm using the word liberal very broadly. Liberal democracy, which is how our Constitution was written, how our country was founded, was the idea that the government is neutral when it comes to religion and religious beliefs.
Okay, there's secularity. Do you notice how the debate over whether or not America is a Christian country can never get resolved? It's because of this. Were the founding fathers Christian? How could they not be Christian when you look at their cultural pedigree? Yet, they're also deist. Well, what's happening with deism? In fact, they were talking about deism on Twitter today.
It does not impose religion and religious beliefs on people. it doesn't impose a worldview on people. It doesn't say, it doesn't hook up to Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever. And therefore, it's big on freedom of association, freedom of speech. It's a pluralistic society, so you have Jews and Catholics and various kinds of Protestants and atheists, and it doesn't impose a worldview or religious views on people. And
Now, what it really doesn't impose is what we in the secular age look at as religious practice, going to church. I mean, the Puritan fight, if you read early Puritan history in New England, this big battle as to basically, all right, now we've really got the government here in our little outcropping in Massachusetts. Can we make everyone go to church? Can we make them all Christian? Can we, in some ways, realize this Protestant dream of a holy city? Can we really have the New Jerusalem? I did a video early on about the founding of New Haven, Connecticut. Just look at that history and think about what they were doing eschatologically, and think about that dream, and think about how and why that dream died.
or moral values on people. And it came out of the Enlightenment because the Enlightenment was born a couple hundred years before America in the wars of religion, when everybody was fighting. Basically, people were dying as to which religion my country is going to be. And a lot of the thinkers of Europe came up and said, "Hey, you know what? Let's create a society in which there's no one religion that is the official religion, and we are coming together just as reasonable people, and we decide how we want to live together. And we park our religion at the door when we come into the public realm, and we make laws based on common good and that kind of thing." And for a very long time, that worked.
Now, common good is such a tricky thing. And it's those kinds of things that I've just been thinking about almost obsessively over the last 5 years. Obsessively is a little much, sort of repeatedly. I always circle around to it, and it's like, oh yeah, you again, common good. How do we know that? Where's that dead reckoning? To what degree is that bottom up, and to what degree is that top down? How is that emergent, and how is that emanation, and how is that in some ways sort of, we're going to talk about the end of this video, sort of a sensibility. That's going to be, if authenticity has been the word for the last 20 years, it could very well be that sensibility will be the word for the next.
America. And I just want you to know that was based on, common good and that kind of thing. And for a very long time, that worked in America. And I just want you to know that that's the problem. The big problem is that liberal democracy is in crisis. And the reason it's in crisis is because, and here's the irony, and I don't think I think I could trace this out if I was writing something down. I think it would be a little hard orally right now to do it. But weirdly enough, liberal democracy kind of led to the decline of religion, probably. Because it really said, religion is okay for your private life, but when it comes to the public life, we really don't need it. It's really not important. We just use science and reason to figure out how we're going to live. And you park your religion at the door when we come out here and talk together. Whether you're a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist, you come together, and we just decide this. And it was part of I think what weakened faith, because it was really saying faith is a private thing. It just makes you happy, but it really isn't all that necessary for how you live your whole life. Whatever.
And it really doesn't tell you truth. Well, what do you mean truth? Well, remember, sort of part of what happens at the end of the 19th century is that the modernist fundamentalist split is over a lot of this. So the modernists basically said, well, we can't trust the Bible for science and history, but we can trust it for morality. And the fundamentalists said, screw you, we're going to trust it for everything, all the way down. And as is often, as Girardian theory about mimetic desire, mimetic rivals become twins. And so in some ways, modernists and fundamentalists become sort of bizarro twins.
But the fact is that when religion started to decline, the thing that now I have some atheist friends who admit this. Say the thing that actually held us together was not freedom of speech, freedom of association, using our reason. What held us together was like 80% of the population went to either a Catholic or a Protestant church. They actually
Back to practice. Freedom of religion, freedom of association, pretty vague, abstract ideas. It's practice. Well, why are so many moderates talking about weekly communion? That's a weird thing in the CRC. Weekly communion. I've done a lot of thinking about house visitation and communion and sort of how the CRC develops. And one of the key things in the evolution of the CRC was the loss of Sabbatarianism, and because that sort of went at the same time, and you can track it by the rules around swimming in Fairwoods in Whitensville, Massachusetts, or maybe the Christian Reformed Conference grounds on Lake Michigan. Even the existence of these little conference grounds that were, they were sort of a post-war evangelical thing, these conference grounds. And so all of this migration is happening.
went. And that even though, like, the liberals and conservatives in Congress were arguing over taxes or unions, but they would never argue over same-sex marriage. They all thought it would be a horrible thing. In other words, everybody was a nominal, and 80-90% of people were nominal Christians. And because they were nominal Christians, they had
It was Christianity light. You didn't have to go to church. You could be a Jew. You could go to synagogue. You could go to mosque. You could go to someplace else on Sunday. You didn't have to do any of those things. But the values, the formation, Christendom, leftovers.
they had a moral base, and they lived with the illusion that we're really not a Christian country, we're a secular country. But the fact is, they'd never really had to deal with pluralism using liberal democratic, structure. And when real pluralism came along, we found out we couldn't abide it. And so now, here's the first thing that happened. The first group of people that actually moved away from liberal democracy into we're going to impose our worldview on you were the progressives.
Now let's talk about that real pluralism, because again, one of the arguments from the progressive side is, well, local option, that's real pluralism. We'll do us, you do you. And in many ways, the conservatives say, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I know George W. stumbled on that one. Because with women in office, that was the deal, right? Local option. When's the last time a complementarian held a denominational position of high profile? Doesn't happen. Doesn't happen. So, in other words, yeah, we know exactly what's going to happen with your pluralism. First, it's going to be a local option. And then, very quickly, we're going to be reading pieces from the OSJ, and CRC people know what that means, pieces in the banner about gender justice. And then there'll be new forms. And then the code of conduct. And then on and on and on and on and on. And they're like, hey, we've seen this movie. We went through women in office. We know how this goes. Yeah, it's not really pluralism with you, is it?
Now, here's the first thing that happened. The first group of people that actually moved away from liberal democracy into we're going to impose our worldview on you were the progressives. They were the first people to start doing it. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, former, he calls it programmatic secularism rather than procedural secularism. In other words, it used to be the government was secular in the sense of being a neutral umpire and said, okay, we want to make sure everybody has a level playing field to make your case and live your lives. But programmatic secularism goes like this. Put it this way. In the 60s and 70s, even the 50s, if somebody wrote a book saying it's okay to be gay, that would probably be not publishable because it would be banned as obscene speech, right? today, if you try to write a book or say it's not okay to be gay, now it's also condemned as obscene speech, except it's called hate speech. And what's happened is there was a kind of hegemony. It wasn't pluralistic. There was a kind of nominal Christian hegemony that really did run things. And when that fell apart, now we realize, well, who's going to get in charge of defining hate speech and obscene speech? And progressives said, we're going to do it. And so what they actually have done is they are imposing a kind of programmatic, hard secularism. And conservatives and Christians have seen that. They say, you know what, you're not being neutral anymore. You're really actually pushing. You're actually saying you have to keep your religion totally, totally private, when our religion doesn't allow that. Now, by the way, it's the same problem with Islam. So they're going to have, the more Muslims that are here, the more problems they're going to have there too. But the issue is that conservatives are...
And again, same with immigrants. I mean, if they really wanted to have their pure progressive state, immigration is not your friend.
Pushing back, wrongly, I think, and are saying, yeah, liberal democracy doesn't work. There's a lot of conservatives saying we need Christian nationalism. We actually need to get, the state needs to be overtly Christian, overtly Protestant, or there needs to be, the Catholic integralists say that the Catholic Church should be the state church. And what they're saying is there's absolutely no way to get that moral consensus. We're always going to be fragmented. Liberal democracy doesn't work. And it is a crisis, because the fact is, as long as everybody was a nominal Christian, liberal democracy works, and it doesn't. We're not that anymore. Liberal democracy undermined Christianity and religion in general, and created this situation where we truly are divided. And now the old liberal democratic proceduralism doesn't bring us together. We're just at each other's throats. We have alternate views of reality, totally different views of reality.
Except when we sort of trigger the Girardian scapegoat, and we'll do that on past. We'll do that on our past. We'll do that on other things that conveniently can sort of bind us. Because again, back to the video about the first video I made about Wednesday. It's this breakdown, and the family is breaking up, and we're just grief-stricken about it, and so we cling to whatever sorts of comfort we can find. Now, part of what's happening is that the civil rights awakening religious coattails are ending. Politically, rhetorically, it was that there was so much power unleashed by that civil rights great awakening that you could win any argument with it. And that power's going away. And I think, again, this is partly given pause to the moderates, because moderates are increasingly aware that all of these revolutions really weren't exactly the same. And there's deep questions. There are deep questions about feminism, not just from men. If you look at Louise Perry and Mary Harrington over in the UK, you've got people basically got all the way to the edge of feminism, and they turned around. And they said, hey, this doesn't work. This isn't what we signed up for. Look at my conversation with Mary Harrington. I should probably talk to Louise Perry. Read her book. Look at my conversation with Richard Beck. This is why people are pausing. Tim Keller, in some ways, there are because when sort of the conservatives turned on Tim Keller about 5-6 years ago, there's some videos out there that are basically complaining about Tim Keller, that he's basically a liberal in conservative clothing. And to a degree, they're right. Because if you look at Tim Keller's story, yeah, except that Tim Keller is sort of really proto-IDW in that he was there with the boomers at the counterculture, and he turned back and he landed in the Presbyterian Church. But there's elements of him where he's not a true conservative. He's meta-modern in some way, and we're going to get to that term in a little bit. And that term is not settled. I like Richard Beck's term post-progressive. And I think that's very much who Tim Keller is. Tim Keller is sort of post-progressive, as is Peterson in many ways. So there's a lot of the moderate pauses about Are race, women, and gays, are these all really identical situations? Those analogies are breaking down. And why haven't they really panned out in the same way? In many ways, well, why? Part of it is biology. Race is a footnote compared to sex biologically. It's really difficult. If someone would look at the genetic level to distinguish race at a genetic level, so they tell me really, really hard. Sex, XY. It's pretty easy at a chromosomal level. It's the most obvious thing in the world. And when it comes to looks, I mean, a lot of what we're doing again is we're just sorting through what is a man, what is a woman, how are they related, what can we know about it. And then you get these weird moments like the guy from the Middle East at Synod said, you know, he could have been on Matt Walsh's "What is a Woman" thing, because he's like, everybody in the Middle East knows what a woman is. What's wrong with you people? And you know, everybody knows what homosexual sex is. What's wrong with you people? Isn't it the most obvious thing in the world? And now there's a lot that you can go into that, and I'll probably go into that in subsequent videos in this series. But race has also long been a tag for culture, and it still is, because people have tended, not always, but races are fertily interchangeable. Newsflash. Human beings easily mate productively, reliably across racial lines without any difficulty at all. Not so with sex. I know, it's biology, it's pretty plain, but there it is. And these differences are not insignificant. But in many ways, the CRC Progressives are sticking with the coattail narrative, and you heard it again and again and again and again in Synod. Everything that you heard at Synod seemed, often, most of what you heard at Synod seemed proxy war stuff. And progressives who have been sort of leaking left for a whole bunch of reasons, well, now they might split left. They're going to figure that out. While racism is endemic, racism we will always have with us. It's just too easy for people to tribe up with respect to race. It happens in prisons, it happens in neighborhoods. But again, often as sort of a tag for culture. It's settled in a way that women in church office in the Christian Reformed Church has never really been settled. And again, moderates look at that and pause. Anti-racism has in some ways become the March of Dimes. What do I mean by that? Just do a little research on the March of Dimes. They fought polio. What happened after we had a reliable, unlike COVID, we do not have a COVID vaccine. There, I said it. Am I going to get the YouTube thing? I don't know. But that COVID vaccine doesn't mean you don't get COVID, because I had 3 shots and I still got it a second time. So there you have it. Anti-race, and I know you can go ahead and leave a comment. Yeah, but it lessens the. Yeah, go ahead. Have the COVID debate if you want to in the comment section. I really don't care. Anti-racism has sort of become the March of Dimes. Polio's cured. What are we going to do with all of our activism and organization and jobs and all of this? It's basically boomer sunk cost activism. We can't let this stuff go away. And again, I'm not denying that racism is still with us. Racism is always with us, but it is not the same type of issue it was. And I'm not saying there isn't such a thing as racism getting into institutions. I'm not saying there isn't such things as subtle racism. I see subtle racism in myself. I mean, that's all true, but it is not the same that it was as it was in the 20th century. It is not the same. And you have to acknowledge both of those realities. Women in church office has not been settled, and it looks like it won't be. And that was part of the progressivist promise. Women in church office is going to be settled, and complementarians are going to go away. I remember having a visit from someone who was working with one of these projects that I was working with, and she came out to visit me to talk about this project. And then she discovered that there were Christian Reformed and RCA church plants being planted by complementarians who basically had zero intention of ever having a woman serve as deacon, elder, or minister. And this woman was aghast. How could this be? And it's like, quite frankly, because you don't get out enough. One evening, I was homeschooling during the day and doing my office hours at night. I get a phone call from somebody random. See, I do randos on the internet. Back in the day, I did randos from the telephone. Hi, can you be my mentor? Who are you? Well, are you a Reformed pastor? Yes, I am. I want a Reformed pastor to mentor me. Okay, what do you know about being Reformed? Well, I grew up in an evangelical church and now I want to be Reformed. Okay, how did you become Reformed? Because I would have thought you probably would have become Reformed as a pastor. I became Reformed on the internet. That was the first dawning of something that has continued to awaken in me. You became Reformed on the internet? Yeah, and that was before social media, but probably Reddit or on internet chat boards. You became Reformed in internet chat board. He was sort of early wave, young, restless, and Reformed. Never been to I said, have you ever been to a Reformed church? No. Okay. Sure, we'll talk. We'll have lunch. And he's been a friend ever since. But there it is. And so then he gets married, and he marries an evangelical girl. And 2-3 years into marriage, things are getting ugly. Doesn't look like the marriage is going to make it. They are two heading in a different direction. She basically finally decides she's going to go with him on the young, restless, and Reformed thing. Everything smooths its way out. Marriage is a lot happier. They have kids. They find churches that are complementarian, unlike my church. And yeah, off they go. CRC, RCA Progressives come and see that and say, that's not supposed to happen. History only goes one way. There's a right side and a wrong side of history, and they went from the right side of history to the wrong side of history. Yeah, so did Dave Fettis. There's a bunch of other names I could name too, but more pain associated with some of these other names. History doesn't just go one way. In fact, you don't know the way history is going, except, okay, now I'm a millennial, and you'd say that Doug Wilson thinks he knows the way history is going more reliable than I do. Well, I think I know history's end, but how it's going to get there? I'm a millennial. God is full of surprises. Women in office has not been settled, and it looks like it won't. And again, as the point I've made in many videos, once the progressives, with the help of the moderates, won that battle, then suddenly the progressives are like, we're not going to talk about this. Oh, you got to hire someone for the denominational office? That guy's a complementarian? Nobody's going to say it, but it's like, he ain't getting the job. He ain't getting the job. How can he have this job if he has to work with women? You think complementarians can't work with women? It's awfully more subtle than that. There's too many other connected variables to really settle women in office. And by that, I don't mean that CRC women clergy should be anxious. I don't think it's going to flip. I don't think it's going to flip. It's a different issue. It might continue to mutate in some interesting ways. I don't think it's going to flip anytime soon. Words and actions follow sensibilities. 2 recent videos that are completely disconnected from this. One from Thomas Flight, who sent me a really lovely message saying, I've watched your channel on and off. He has a really good channel. Why do movies feel so different now? He talks about modern and meta-modern. Oh. And then sort of Damian Walter comes in and says, I'm not sure he quite gets that right. The whole meta-modern thing, we don't know what that means yet. It's not settled like. It'd be like using the word woke in 2018. It wasn't really until 2020, 2021 that sort of the broad cultural assumption about what we're talking about when we're talking about woke means. So it may still be too early to see if meta-modern is going to be the word that wins out. I do like Richard Beck's post-progressive. But the problem with post-progressive, well, there's problems with both terms, meta-modern or post-progressive. But watch either of those two videos. They're great videos. They're really easy to watch. And they're really helpful, especially the Thomas Flight video. Sorry, Damon. I love your work, but Thomas Flight's video was the main one to watch to sort of get a sense of the sensibilities of what's coming after postmodernity. Because we realize we can't live in a postmodern, there's no such thing as a postmodern human being. You're just too definitive. But modernity is going away, as Tim Keller noted. So, as Nate Van Dennen noted in our live stream, we're debating theological anthropology. Nate is absolutely right. That's what we're working on. And in that sense, ecclesiology follows anthropology. Race and sex bend the knee to transhumanism. It's kind of what we're seeing. Feeling our way forward with our feet in the swamp. Jordan Peterson did a video with Eric Metaxas, and I almost didn't watch it because I've watched plenty of Metaxas, and it's like, I know your shtick, buddy. I know your shtick. But somebody said, oh, there's some interesting stuff in there, so I watched it. There are some good moments, and Jordan Peterson giving you this image about, says, I'm sort of feeling my way forward with my feet. And I thought, how does that work? I had sort of an image of a dark room, and I should have had more of an estuary image. Because he said, I'm sort of feeling my way forward in a swamp. I can't see beneath the water, but I'm just sort of feeling for rocks. And then when I find a rock I can stand on, and then I kind of find another rock. And I think that's kind of what we're doing right now. Almost done with the video, but still got to reposition myself. Conscious rationality is always the last to know. And that's what's happening both with us individually and with our extended bodies, our collectives. Is there more to come? I hope. I'm tremendously bad at following through on some of these promises because sometimes I get the ideas out. But there's enough ideas in that other video that I didn't publish that is over in the new membership section that, I don't really like the YouTube membership thing. They take 30%. You know, if you really like what I'm doing and want to say thank you financially, send money to my church. Keep my little church afloat as long as we can. No, I'm not thriving like Neeland. Maybe if I'd go woke, we'd thrive. I don't think so. It didn't work for City Church San Francisco. It certainly wouldn't work in Sacramento. The reason is because I know my neighbors. I know why they do and don't go to church and what they are and aren't looking for. And that's the product of every video. Anyway, more to come. The death of Born That Way. It's underlying most CRC progressive rhetoric about this issue, and it's going away. They're making arguments on something that is already almost dead. And that's part of the reason their arguments have no power. We're going to talk about anti-porn. I think there's an essence of Girardian scapegoat comfort in the CRC with respect to it. But I think the argument is actually finally a loser for progressives. I think progressives are going to wind up with Nadia Bolz-Weber's camp. I really do. She's the, so not only, so of course the emergent comes out of the seeker movement and there's a big split, but again, it's a Girardian split. It's sort of, you have sort of mimetic twins of Mark Driscoll on one side and Nadia Bolz-Weber on the other. It's fascinating watching these things just emerge. I've made videos about those two before. And people get really upset when I talk about Nadia Bolz-Weber. They don't mind hating on Mark Driscoll because Mark Driscoll drinks liberal tears, and if you hate on Mark Driscoll, he will just take that. That's so I love this little game, King of Tokyo. They have one card. You're only making it stronger, and that's what I say to the progressives who want to go out and attack Abide and want to attack Mark Driscoll. You keep attacking them in that way, you're only making them stronger. You keep attacking Ben Shapiro in that way, you're only making him stronger. Their group is living off those kinds of attacks. If you want to weaken that sort of dynamic, ignore it. Don't attack it. But they can't help themselves. They're so angry. They're so hurt. So, they just keep filling Ben Shapiro's cup. It's a strange world. Progressivism has an eschatological problem. And, Sam noted that again in that live stream. And Sam's like, and I knew he was going to say it because I've been thinking this for a long time. So what exactly was their end game? They'll point to the book of Revelation, but the book of Revelation, you gotta sort of feel your way through that swamp because, the Johannine corpus in the New Testament, pretty doggone antithetical. If the antithesis really gets under your skin, you've got to be real careful with the Gospel of John, 1 John, and the book of Revelation. It's tough stuff. And this is evidenced by our secular poets. Vision of the future. Just look at all of our visions of the near-term future are they're apocalyptical, yes, and they're also catastrophic. It's AI, it's nuclear, it's ecological. Conservatism isn't quite what we think it is. So I got to be a little fair. And the Abide group is not my grandfather's conservatism. It's 100 years have gone by. So hopefully this slide will help me make more to come. And I've got, case in point, Becket Cook and Rosaria Butterfield. More they just needed to really meet a winsome gay person. That doesn't work with them. See, the problem with identity politics is fringes have fringes, and you'll always be able to find someone who's counter-narrative. And if you play your culture war in a particular way, Becket Cook and Rosaria Butterfield have power because of mimetic rivalry. Should probably have Luke Burgess on the channel. Talk more about that. His conversation with Jonathan Peugeot was outstanding. So so what happened with the whole membership thing is that Google kept sending me emails and said, look, Vander Clay, we'll give you $500 if you just turn it on. I get $500 if I turn it on? Okay. I kind of want a new camera for my vacation so that I can play around with maybe making some other kinds of videos. That'll probably only go in the member only section. And then they said $500 more if 31 people sign up. Oh, okay. So why not try it? Maybe it'll be a disaster and I'll shut it down in 6 months, but I'll still have a cool $1,000 from Google. So, hey, why not? Just letting you know what the back end is. But yeah, for those of you who think having a YouTube channel will make you wealthy, only if, number one, you won't get wealthy from AdSense, which is the ads on YouTube. I'm gonna the videos that I'm also gonna put members only videos. I'm gonna make a separate video about this. I'm also gonna make members only videos. I'm not gonna have them monetized. I'll monetize them when I put them out. I don't know if Google will honor that. They will put ads on non-monetized videos. They just will. So no promises there. So yeah, that video I posted I thought was too rough, too ranty, early draft of some of these thoughts, and the thoughts continue to gel. So I decided that the thoughts deserved separate treatment. I'll likely put videos there that for one reason or another are a bit too much, even for my publication standards, which are astoundingly low. That might be a good thing. That might be a bad thing. So yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment. I'd love to know what you think.